Okay, we'll start with this. Some news you might have come across a few days ago. Eddie Hearn has told us being pro boxing fans, that he has made an offer to Joshua Buatsi to face Dimitri Bivol next.
You know what that means?
It means a few things. It means that we're not getting anywhere in terms of a Dimitri Bivol versus Artur Beterbiev undisputed light heavyweight title fight, though at this point I think that much is obvious. Bob is more interested in sending Artur to London to face...
More interested in shipping him across the pond to face Anthony Yard than making that fight.
That much we knew already, that much we've already addressed and talked about. Thus, this fight could be in the works, could be underway. I've said it before, and I'll say it here again. I don't think Joshua Buatsi's ready for that fight. I don't think he's had the necessary experiences to unseat Dimitri Bivol as a fighter, as a champion. I don't think Joshua Buatsi is a prolific enough puncher. He's not busy enough.
He's the kind of guy picks his punches, waits for the right moment to let him go.
And against a defensively responsible fighter like a Dimitri Bivol, waiting for the right window of opportunity to open is an exercise in futility, as this is not the kind of fighter that sacrifices defense for offense. This ain't the kind of fighter that makes mistakes that you can capitalize on.
That being said, I don't think Joshua Buatsi is a prolific enough puncher.
Not for this fight, or a big enough puncher to where he can look to take Dimitri out with one shot, with a single punch. Don't get me wrong, Joshua Buatsi does appear to have fast hands and strong shots, strong punches, but not so strong.
Dimitri Bivol ate a clean right hand from the very heavy-handed Joe Smith Jr. I think he'll be all right with Joshua Buatsi.
For Dimitri Bivol, this is little more than just a keep busy fight and an opportunity to endear himself to a UK audience. The UK fight fans, I've no doubts that if this fight gets made, it will go down across the pond in the United Kingdom.
Already beaten one of their boys before in Craig Richards, who Joshua Buatsi just fought.
Joshua Buatsi just beat, though this is a rather sizable step up in class, a sizable step up in competition from Craig Richards to Dimitri Bivol.
I think Dimitri can beat Joshua Buatsi on points comfortably.
And I'll go as far as saying that there's a fragility to Joshua Buatsi whenever a clean shot lands, whenever he gets hit, to whereas I wouldn't rule out a knockout. I wouldn't rule out a stoppage.
Dimitri Bivol just racked up the best professional victory of his career against Canelo Alvarez. He's got to be riding high right now.
Yeah, I think Dimitri Bivol beats Joshua Buatsi, perhaps comfortably. Joshua Buatsi's methodology, he just ain't got the right style for the job. You've got to be busy against a finesse fighting kind of guy like Dimitri Bivol. Force the fight, make it rough and tumble. And Joshua Buatsi, he just ain't that kind of guy.
So you know what this means? This means that Bivol versus Beterbiev ain't about to happen.
And it also means that Dimitri Bivol, at this point in the juncture, he must not be under orders by way of the WBA to satisfy his mandatory challenger, Zurdo Ramirez. Not if they're in the process of negotiating a fight between him and Joshua Buatsi. Oscar De La Hoya took to social media and stated, Zurdo Ramirez made 2 successful title eliminators and is now ready to face Dimitri Bivol for the WBA.
Well, that's nice, but did they actually order the fight?
I don't get the sense they did. I know of no such order having come down from either Gilberto Mendoza or the WBA ordering Dimitri to fight Zurdo. So until such a time as an order comes down, Dimitri Bivol's got the luxury of choice.
Stylistically, a Zurdo Ramirez fight as opposed to a Joshua Buatsi fight.
Stylistically, a Ramirez fight might be more appealing to the eye because Zurdo Ramirez, he is a prolific puncher. He's a busy guy. He's a southpaw, and he's quite statuesque, even for light heavyweight.
I feel like Zurdo's more ready for a fight with Dimitri than Joshua Buatsi is.
You could do either fight on either side of the Atlantic Ocean and make some waves, make some ripples, but for my money, Ramirez versus Bivol is a somewhat better fight, more exciting, more appealing, and more attractive than Bivol versus Buatsi.
It's more intriguing.
Zurdo Ramirez has enough size to where you're going to have to really work to put a dent in this guy. Him being a southpaw, that makes things somewhat troublesome as well. And him being a prolific puncher, a busy puncher, that gives that for Dimitri to have to work around. Whereas with Joshua Buatsi,
he just doesn't have enough of a work rate to make Dimitri uncomfortable.
I feel like Zurdo's more ready for this than Joshua Buatsi is. Though I'm fine with either fight, if I'm being honest. I'm okay with Bivol versus Buatsi, and I'm okay with Bivol versus Ramirez, though it does look like
Bivol versus Buatsi's an in-house fight. Easier to make.
We'll just have to wait and see what develops and whether or not Bivol versus Buatsi is actually next.
Is that going to be Dimitri Bivol's next fight?
Another news I'm sure you might have heard already.
La gran sensación del momento, Bam Rodriguez.
Landing the co-main event on Canelo versus Golovkin 3. Opponent coming soon.
That news comes to us by way of Barboza Box.
And that news broke a few days ago that Bam Rodriguez will be participating on the undercard of Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin 3. A smart move, in my opinion, as Bam Rodriguez. This is a guy who's taken the super flyweight division and boxing in many ways by storm. Americans don't characteristically watch the lower weights, 112, 115 pounds. But Bam Rodriguez
beating Carlos Cuadras on short notice and stopping Sorung Visa.
Well, that helps. Taking out two of the four kings in the super flyweight division has gone a long way in a short amount of time to getting Bam Rodriguez a profile. Some people think that he may end up facing Roman Gonzalez next. But to that, boxing scribe Dave Jonovan tweeted, "File this under FWIW. I'm told that any talk of Bam versus Chocolatito is merely a concept at this stage. Nothing formal in place, and both fighters consider the other to be like family. Bam has said he's targeting 112 next. Chocolatito's team vehemently denies any such talks."
We know that there's a growing demand for such a fight, but this has always been the case. This has always been the situation.
To Bam Rodriguez, facing Roman Gonzalez is a last resort. When it comes to Roman Gonzalez, Juan Estrada versus Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez 3 is reportedly now being planned to take place next in November or December. It's claimed Estrada, very likely, won't be fighting Joshua Franco after all.
It's a sordid affair between 112 and 115 pounds.
Where people might be expecting Bam Rodriguez to at some point take on Roman Gonzalez, doesn't look like that's going to be his next opponent, his next fight. This was the last news we heard when it came to Roman Gonzalez, that he may be facing Juan Francisco Estrada for a third time later on this year. Juan Francisco Estrada, who's currently under orders by way of both the WBA and the WBC. Joshua Franco, Bam's brother, that's Juan's mandatory. But the WBC very recently ordered Juan to take on Chocolatito, if you can believe that. Juan being the WBC's franchise champion. Originally, franchise champions didn't have mandatories, but now they do.
Can I get a Sprite with that word sandwich?
Way it breaks down. Golden Boy Promotions, some weeks ago, won the rights to Juan Francisco Estrada versus Joshua Franco, Bam's brother. And that's by way of the WBA. By way of the WBC, afterwards, they ordered Juan to take on Chocolatito.
Last news on Juan we heard is that he's leaning towards the Choco fight.
And if he ends up taking the Choco fight, that can only mean that he will surrender the WBA super flyweight title to Bam's brother, Joshua Franco.
I think that's a big part of the reason they want to move Bam down to 112 pounds.
They don't want both brothers campaigning at the same weight, fighting for the same belts. Bam Rodriguez is on the matchroom side of things, whereas Joshua Franco, he's over there at Golden Boy.
Same platform, different promotional outfits.
And as stated, if Juan Francisco Estrada decides to go ahead with the Chocolatito fight instead of the Joshua Franco fight, that can only mean that Juan will vacate the WBA title and Joshua Franco will become, in effect, this division's WBA champion, full champion.
Meanwhile, Bam Rodriguez may end up moving downstairs to 112 pounds.
I don't know what that means for that WBC super flyweight title he's currently holding. I don't know if he has intentions of vacating it or winning multiple titles at multiple weights and holding them simultaneously.
I just know that's what the plan is, and that's what Robert Garcia, his trainer, his corner, seems to want. He wants Bam to move down.
The last news on Bam is that he's set to make his next ring appearance on the undercard of Canelo versus Golovkin 3. Bam himself took to his social media and stated, "Got some big news coming soon."
We ain't got no undercard information when it comes to Canelo versus Golovkin at this time outside of Bam.
Outside of Bam Rodriguez being the co-main event to the main event?
A smart promotional move, if I do say so myself.
What better way to familiarize Bam to an audience that may not know him, that Chicano audience that has helped make Canelo Alvarez the biggest draw in boxing in this country? What better way to do that for a fighter of Mexican descent than making him the co-main event to the main event?
Co-main to Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin. A lot of eyes are going to be on that fight.
That means a lot of eyes are going to be on Bam if this news checks out. Depending on who he fights, they might be in store for a real treat. This news comes to us at a time when Lawrence Okolie and Eddie Hearn, they're not seeing eye to eye. There seems to be a rift between them. If I'm being honest, I don't imagine that Eddie is broken up over losing Lawrence Okolie when he has an emerging star here in America in Bam Rodriguez. Let's face it.
Bam's a hell of a lot more fun to watch than Lawrence.
As Lawrence Okolie prepares to depart from Matchroom as his promotional outfit, Bam Rodriguez is ascending as an emerging star and one of the best and brightest young fighters in the sport today.
So where Matchroom may be losing one champion, they're gaining another, a better champion.
At least a more marketable one with a more fan-friendly style.
Let's see who they put Bam in there with next.
And finally, a story that is grabbing a lot of attention. Devin Haney took to his social media and simply stated October, at which point news broke by way of Michael Benson that Vasyl Lomachenko has now declared himself ready to fight again and has asked for a bout in October. Top Ranks Todd Duboff has stated, Loma previously turned down the George Kambosos Jr. fight earlier this year to stay in Ukraine and defend his country.
So Devin Haney's hinting at an October return.
And so is Vasyl Lomachenko. Could we see a fight between these two boys? Well, it's almost too good to be true. And in boxing, usually when something seems too good to be true, that's because it is.
It probably is.
It's a possibility that Vasyl Lomachenko could take on Devin Haney in October for the undisputed crown at lightweight. It's a possibility, though how much of a probability is the question. How likely is that to happen?
Dan Canastota.
It's Canobio.
Dan Canobio of CompuBox stated,
How I see 135 playing out. Lomachenko versus Nikitila in October. Haney versus Kambosos in November or December. Haney Lomachenko in the spring of 2023. Seems realistic enough, doesn't it?
a realistic enough timeline, yeah.
Lomachenko versus Nikitila could happen. That is the same Nikitila that Shakur Stevenson beat on points down there at 130 pounds more recently. That's the same Nikitila that battered former WBC super featherweight champion Miguel Berchelt up there at lightweight.
If Devin's busy fighting George for a second time, Loma may end up fighting Nikitila.
When it comes to Devin Haney facing George Kambosos for a second time, the former unified champion George Kambosos, 29, recently disclosed that he had activated the rematch clause, telling News Corp that while a venue has not been finalized yet, the fight, which contractually must take place in Australia once more, may end up in either Melbourne, Sydney, or Brisbane.
I don't want to see a second fight. I don't want to see a rematch.
I honestly don't think a rematch between George and Devin is going to go any differently than their first meeting did, than their first fight. Put simply, George Kambosos Jr., I don't think he can change that much in that amount of time.
No, I don't think he can change that much in just one fight.
Change is needed because Devin Haney's not going to make the defensive lapses in judgment that Teofimo Lopez did when he fought George. Those countering opportunities, they're not going to be there. George himself stated, I know I can win a rematch. I will make some changes, and this is my destiny to show how great I am and get those belts back. But given how lopsided the first fight was and how ineffectual Kambosos looked at times, there has been plenty of chatter in the boxing world suggesting a rematch would be redundant. Arum, who promotes the 23-year-old Haney, seemed to hint at his line of thinking in a recent interview with a group of reporters after the final press conference at Madison Square Garden in New York City for the light heavyweight unification bout between Joe Smith and Artur Beterbiev. Arum believes Kambosos would be better served taking on a tune-up fight as a way to rebuild his confidence. Say, before jumping back in to fight Haney, Arum made it clear that such a decision would have to be agreed upon by all parties so that there would be no breach of contract. Kambosos is promoted by Lou DiBella.
There's a contract for him to fight Kambosos again in a rematch. Again, when sensible people have a contract and there's another way to go, you might be able to do that.
Perhaps from a sense of pride, George Kambosos Jr.'s fighting spirit, wanting to get those belts back as soon as possible, wanting to run it back immediately. It's understandable, and that he has the option to do so, well, we knew that going in.
But that doesn't make the rematch any more attractive, any more appealing.
I don't think it works out any differently the second time out.
In other words, nobody's talking about breaching a contract, but it might be worthwhile for Kambosos to take another fight as a tune-up fight, and then fight the winner of Haney and who Haney would be fighting. All that would be possible.
At the same time, Arum noted that if the rematch happens, Haney would be more than willing to go back to Australia to fight Kambosos. And why not? He beat him in one-sided fashion in front of his own fans, in his own country, on his own home turf. Doing it 2 times.
I just told you, I don't think the second fight goes any differently than the first did.
I could see George attempting to up the tempo, throw more punches in bunches, but George just doesn't have the characteristics of an, according to Hoyle, pressure fighter. And that's what you need to take a pure boxer like a Devin Haney. That's what you need to take a fighter like that out of his comfort zone. George can't just become that fighter overnight, that kind of fighter.
But there is a contract for a rematch. Absolutely. And knowing the Haneys and what honorable people they are, they're not gonna breach that contract.
No one expects them to. In truth, it might behoove George Kambosos Jr. to take on Devin before Devin gets the chance to fight Vasyl Lomachenko, because hypothetically speaking, if Devin were to fight Loma in October and lose the belts to him, well,
Hypothetically speaking, of course.
hypothetically speaking, if Devin Haney ends up fighting Vasyl Lomachenko in October, and he ends up losing, he loses the belts to Loma, there goes George's best shot at winning those belts back. Now, I'm not telling you that I give George any kind of odds to beat Devin in a rematch. I'm just telling you he stands a better chance of beating Devin in a rematch than beating Vasyl Lomachenko.
I don't give him any kind of odds to beat Vasyl Lomachenko.
And I don't doubt George's heart. Lest we forget how we got here. Initially, George was going to fight Vasyl Lomachenko in Australia, but the war started and Vasyl Lomachenko stayed behind, so Devin Haney took his place, and Devin Haney had the fight. Devin Haney won the belts. I don't doubt George's heart or his willingness to fight these fighters. I doubt his chances, his ability.
I doubt he can beat either of those two boys, either Devin Haney or Vasyl Lomachenko.
There's wisdom in what Bob Arum is suggesting, don't get me wrong, there is, but a headstrong and prideful fighter like a George Kambosos Jr., a warrior, he wants to run it back.
He's got a rematch clause, so it is what it is.
Doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in a second fight here stateside amongst the fight fans. I wonder how the Australians feel about it. The ones who showed up to support their man and root him on. I wonder how they feel about a second fight. Do they think it'll go any differently? Will they show up in the second fight the same way they did in the first?
What's the commercial value of a rematch when the first fight was so one-sided?
We don't know right now for sure who Devin's going to fight. We're just going to have to wait and see.
But I'll say it again, I don't really want to see a rematch.